Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So nobody walked out when you saw that the title had changed. That's good. That's a good sign. They probably wouldn't give you your money back anyway. What are you going to do? So no, the earlier title was A Radically Empirical Approach to the Study of Consciousness. It's the same material, but from a different perspective. Because when I looked at the earlier PowerPoint slides, I thought, well, I've covered a lot of this material in earlier lectures right here at Vajrayana Institute. So why not give them something a bit more challenging? Which still will be a radically empirical approach to the study of consciousness. But it's going to be at a kind of a more challenging level. So, I just tell you to forward. So, there we go. This whole talk tonight is really going to be about empiricism, and specifically radical empiricism, I'll get to shortly. But I'm suggesting here that the spirit of empiricism, of really taking experience very seriously, and specifically our own, not just taking seriously the experiences of scientists. For example, many of you have been probably watching the news that in the nearest star, only about 4.5 light years away, really a stone's throw away, it would take us 70,000 years to get there at our present technology. There seems to be a planet that is somewhat comparable to our own. It might conceivably be even habitable. So that was based on observations, right? So they take their observations seriously, but the scientific materialists don't take ours seriously. So an astronomer, very well known one in the United States, he's very charismatic, very bright, extremely articulate. Astronomer Neil deGrasse Tyson, he appears on the media a lot. He's just a wonderfully charming, charismatic man. But he's also a very, very committed materialist. And so he writes here, as a scientist, I need something better than your eyewitness testimony. Because even if in the court of law, eyewitness testimony is a high form of evidence, enough to send somebody to life imprisonment, in the court of science, it is the lowest form of evidence you could possibly put forth. So, eyewitness testimony. Who's it referring to? His? I don't think so. No, in fact, I know the context, and that is speaking out of a context of materialism. The only observations that count, when you speak of evidence-based, that's a big loaded term. Evidence-based means physical evidence. Non-physical evidence doesn't count. But not just physical evidence, like I saw a UFO yesterday, which I didn't. We'd say, well, I saw something physical and it was a UFO. It could have been a kind of bug that I couldn't identify. It was flying and I couldn't identify what kind of bug, so it's unidentified flying object. It could be. It doesn't have to be spooky. But number one, the only kind of eyewitness testimony that counts is a physical, but also, frankly, only if a scientist makes it. The rest of us, it's the lowest form. So it's really, it's turf. It's turf. Philosopher John Searle, one of the most prominent philosophers of mind in the United States, he comments, and he writes extensively on the nature of mind. He's a philosopher of mind. He writes, if by introspection we mean a special capacity, just like vision, only less colorful, I guess his introspective abilities are monochrome. I don't know. If by this we mean a special capacity that we have to spect intro, to look within, then it seems to me there is no such capacity. That's rather bold, isn't it? There could not be, because the model of specting intro requires a distinction between the object spected and the specting of it, and we cannot make this distinction for conscious states. It's a very interesting monolithic kind of view of the mind, that there's one chunky thing called a mind, like a rock, and the rock can't hit itself, I guess. But I do find it astonishing, because I met him, I actually debated with him a long time ago. And is he really not aware of his own thoughts? He's not aware of his moods, his emotions, his desires, not aware of anything going on in his mind, because the mind is one thing and it can't observe itself. But that's his position, and it's actually a very common position, not universally held. But among academic psychologists, it's very widespread, neuroscientists, widespread. Philosophers, not at all unusual to take this view that, in fact, I just read, and I've quoted recently an article that was published in the New York Times by a philosopher, again a philosopher, but the director of a center at Duke University pertaining to neuroscience, and he said, you have no privileged access to your own thoughts. There is no first-person perspective, and you cannot observe your own thoughts. You know more about your own thoughts than anybody else does. I don't really know what to say to that, but it is a view. I mean, I feel like I'm going to a zoo and seeing very odd species. But then what really threw me is here's a Buddhologist, and he's a scholar. He runs the Center for Buddhist Studies at UC Berkeley now. And when I read this about 20 years ago when I was doing my research for my dissertation at Stanford, I was really nonplussed by his writings, because he says, well, experience construed as that which is immediately present may indeed be both irrefutable and indubitable. We must remember that whatever epistemological certainty experience may offer is gained only at the expense of any possible discursive meaning or significance. To put it another way, all attempts to signify inner experience are destined to remain well-meaning squirms that get us nowhere. So we have it from an astronomer, we have it from a philosopher, another philosopher, and Treisman, very, very distinguished psychologist, said all of our experiences consist of hallucination, and when we have subjects and we ask them to report on their first-person experience, we do not regard what they say as true, we simply say it's true that they said it. That's all. I mean, that's data, because that's physical data gathered by a scientist. And then a person who is a professional scholar of Buddhism, basically he says that when you meditate, nothing happens in terms of experience. You're just indoctrinating yourself with a doctrine. So you know as much about meditation by reading books on it as you do by meditating. So we see a similar theme here across the board of a radical expulsion, dismissal of first-person experience, unless it's that of a Buddhologist or a philosopher or an astronomer doing their own thing, because they're not discrediting themselves. They're just discrediting everybody else. Go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So I do find something similar here, because what I'm seeking, many of you know, I would love to see catalyzed in my lifetime, is the first true revolution in the mind sciences. The scientific study of the mind has been going on for about 135 years, but I think it's really a stretch to say that there's actually been a revolution in the mind sciences. Sometimes people suggest Freud or Jung, and not to put down anything they've said, but simply the impact of Freud and Jung's very ingenious theories and so forth has not had the impact on the mind sciences as Galileo had on astronomy, as Darwin had on biology. There's no comparison. And moreover, many people reject Freud outright, and many, many people disregard Jung. So if it's a revolution, it can't be such a narrow niche. And so, but we go back to Galileo's time, and I find some very interesting parallels. A friend of his, Cesare Cremonini, is that okay? Cremonini. I have to say Cremonini. Cremonini. A professor of Aristotelian thought. Now bear in mind, this is how he makes his bread and butter. This is his living. That he is professing Aristotle's thought, who was the philosopher, spoke with tremendous authority for the medievalist. This friend, Cremonini, refused to look through a telescope. When Galileo was reporting what he saw, this fellow refused to look, for Galileo's observation contradicted the views of Aristotle. Now he's making his living teaching Aristotle, so the last thing he wants to do is look through a telescope and discredit his own profession, and then lose his job. And so there was definitely some financial interest here. Don't look, because you might see something and you don't want to see it. So better save yourself some time, don't look. And so similarly, many scientific materialists refuse to observe the mind, for their introspective observations may turn out to be incompatible with their beliefs. And that is, when you start observing thoughts and emotions and desires and dreams and so forth, it's pretty patently obvious that all of them are non-physical, in the sense of having no physical characteristics and being unmeasurable with any physical instrument. And moreover, they have clearly causal efficacy. Anybody who doesn't think that their thoughts, emotions, and desires have causal efficacy in the natural world is just not paying attention. So better not to look. Better not to look. And in academic psychology, I want to draw a sharp distinction. In clinical psychology, the writings of Freud, in psychophysics, and other areas, introspection does have a role. But in academic psychology, I took a course on academic psychology, cognitive psychology, and introspection was dismissed in the preface and never alluded to again. It had no role. Observing the mind has no role in understanding the mind. It's ironic, but that is in fact the way it is to this day. And so many refuse to look at it because in the same way as Cremonini, I don't want to get in there too deeply because I might actually start to have to challenge my own materialistic beliefs. So that was a friend of his. And then there's an opponent, Giulio Libri. You have to speak Italian with a bit of joie de vivre. Right? If you don't, it's kind of dead Italian. It's like American Italian, German Italian. It's dead on arrival. It's got to be libri. He refused to look through a telescope, for he thought any observations made through it might be optical illusions. And that's an interesting observation, because when you look through a telescope, like when Galileo was looking at the moon, for example, and he discovered the craters of the moon. Nobody ever seen those, or at least reported those before. Well, it looks like those craters on the moon are way out there in deep space, right? Way, way out there. And it looks like the image you're seeing is way out there. And you're seeing images of the moon. But of course, they knew back then, at the time of Galileo, that those images are not coming to you from the moon. Your eyes are not like flypaper, just catching flies coming in, catching images coming in. You're traveling and hitting you in the, like in the retina. But in fact, these images are arising independent upon your brain. Now, they didn't know the details of visual cortex, but they did know that our observations as human beings are likely to be different than what a cat sees, or a rattlesnake, or a dung beetle, or a bat, and so forth. So therefore, our visual observations are made, and we say in this modern terminology, are arising independent upon a human visual cortex. So what we're seeing is not a reflection of what's out there, because human beings didn't make the moon. And so whatever we see, number one, it's illusory in the sense that the appearance seems to be way out there and is not. And number two, why do you think that this reflects or is an appearance of something objective when it is your own anthropocentric visual perception? Therefore misleading, therefore why bother? Why not rely on the Bible and Aristotle? They're much better than your eyeballs, right? And so in a similar way I'm suggesting here, and yeah, many scientific materials refuse to employ introspection to explore the mind, for they think any such first-person observations are illusory and misleading. It's a very, very common notion, almost universal. And that is, don't rely on introspection. It's illusory and misleading. Whatever you see is just going to be so misleading, so unreliable, these may as well just skip it altogether. In other words, it's the same. But Libri had a better reason, had an even more compelling reason than the moderners. Because when you're introspecting, you're observing your thoughts, image and so forth, at least you know that these are created by your own mind. Whereas you look at the image of the moon, then it seems to be out there, that's actually more illusory than observing just mental images in your own mind, which you know are in your own mind and created by your own mind. But if Libri had won the day, if he'd been the Pope and could have, burnt Galileo at the stake and burned anybody else at the stake, then they would have stopped the arising and the development of astronomy altogether. They would have prohibited the use of telescopes, right? Because whatever you see through them is illusory. Don't go there. So it's interesting. I think there are parallels here. You can judge for yourself. Let's move on. Next slide. So now coming to the rescue, William James was very well aware. He lived in primarily the 19th century. He died in 1910. And he was very well of kind of the dogmatism of materialism, as he was perfectly aware of the dogmatism that occurs in religion, in politics, philosophy, and so forth. And he felt that one of the key elements of a remedy for overcoming dogmatism and closed-mindedness was empiricism, but then he added the idea of radical empiricism. I think he probably coined the term. He certainly popularized it. And this is what he say about it. I think it's worth reading. I say empiricism because it is contented to regard its most assured conclusions concerning matters of fact as hypotheses, liable to modification in the course of future experience. So the belief, for example, that the Earth is center of the universe. I mean, the Bible says it, Aristotle said it, and for 1,400 years, from the time of Ptolemy, and I think the 2nd, 3rd century, until the time of Galileo, all the best and brightest people in Western academia all assumed, of course, that the Earth is in the center, the planets go around, and then you can account for very deviations of appearances with epicycles and eccentrics. And it was just kind of like, of course. And then he made them all, that is Copernicus, made them all feel uncomfortable because he questioned that. He questioned common sense of seeing the sun rise and seeing the sun move across the heavens, obviously moving around the Earth. And so, but he said, he considered it, and then Galileo was the one that actually put it to the test of experience. Galileo was the one, not Copernicus, that proved that the geocentric view, Earth being in the center of the universe, he was the one that proved it with empirical evidence. Copernicus gave a good theory to make it plausible. Galileo, with empirical evidence, refuted 1,400 years of blind reliance on Ptolemy. So that's empiricism. But then he says, I say radical because it treats the doctrine of monism. Now, monism for James was materialistic monism, that everything in the universe boils down to matter, its qualities, and emergent properties. That's monism for him. And so radical empiricism, treats the doctrine, the belief system of scientific materialism itself as a hypothesis. And unlike so much of the halfway empiricism that is current under the name of positivism or agnosticism or scientific naturalism, which we also call scientific materialism, radical empiricism, does not dogmatically affirm monism or physicalism or materialism as something with which all experience has got to square. So he's saying this more than 100 years ago. It's so contemporary because most of science says all of experience must square with the belief, the axiom, that everything that's real is physical. That's the only type of evidence that counts as evidence-based. So it's very refreshing. You can see it's utterly free of dogmatism. It's just keep on coming back to experience. Back to experience. Let's move on. So, William James did not invent empiricism, even in the West, of course. Go back to David Hume, you'll find it very clearly there. But now we're going to Asia. So this is where the Buddhism starts to come in. Very famous quote, many of you know this verbatim. This is in one of the Mahayana Sutras. But it's very much in the spirit of the Buddhist teachings. There's just no question. This is how he spoke. When he says, monks, just as the wise accept gold after testing it, by heating, cutting, and rubbing it, so are my words to be accepted after examining them, but not out of respect for me. So, as a religious studies scholar, I have a doctorate in religious studies, then I studied comparative religion. And Buddhism, within modern academia, is almost always, and frankly I think uncritically, and perhaps naively, and almost certainly ethnocentrically, put into one of our boxes that was designed and created in the West. That is, if you want to study Buddhism in the university, you probably shouldn't go to physics. You probably won't find it there, even though Buddhism has some amazing things to say about the physical world. You'll probably not find it in psychology, even though Buddhism is primarily about the nature of mind. Probably won't find it in psychology. Buddhism has elaborate philosophies, which I will discuss somewhat tonight. Philosophy department here or there, but by and large, no. Westerners know philosophy, Easterners know Eastern stuff. But I don't know of any other, so Buddhism is a world religion. That's how we in the West categorize it, not even noticing that the word religion is not found in Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, Mongolian. They don't even have a word for religion. We just superimpose it ethnocentrically on this category because it kind of looks, we see the nuns, and I've seen Christian nuns, and I bet you worship and you pray and you burn incense and you have rituals and you have churches and so forth, and the nuns and the monks, of course, the same. So it must be a religion. It walks like a religion, it quacks like a religion. You see what's on the surface, and then you just put it into the neatest category, overlooking all of the philosophical aspects, the psychological aspects, the rigorous empirical aspects, and so forth. It was a cheap shot, frankly, because you highlight the religious aspects, which are there. And I am religious. I'm not embarrassed about that at all. But then it tends to throw into the shadows everything that does not conform to our Western notion, defined by the Abrahamic religions as religious. So I don't know of any other founder of a world religion who would ever say something like that. That's what Newton might say. Right? That's what scientists would say. Einstein would say. But that's not the kind of thing we expect founders of a religion to say. Because they will say, accept what I'm saying because God said it, or I'm a prophet, or I'm enlightened, or I'm an avatar, or I'm something special, but after all, I said it, and I'm the one, or I'm representing the one that is an absolute authority. That's what religious founders do. And the Buddha says, well, chuck that out, and just test it yourself. And don't accept it unless it really stands up to your most critical analysis. And then we jump to the present, and the Dalai Lama, again, he's speaking in exactly the same vein as the Buddha, and he speaks for Buddhism at its best. I think really in many respects the Dalai Lama embodies and articulates Buddhism at its best, and that's what I'm interested in. I could give lecture after lecture after lecture on the fleas and the moles and the cockroaches and the degenerations of Buddhism. It's very easy to do. There's plenty of work to be done there. But that's not why I study Buddhism. To go off and pick scabs and find faults. If I want to find faults, I don't even have to look outside. I can just spend all the time looking at my own faults. So what I'm interested in Buddhism is Buddhism at its best. Because that's what I like to follow, I like to practice. That's what I like to do my best to share with others. So here's the Dalai Lama speaking of Buddhism at the best. At its best, a general basic stance of Buddhism is that it is inappropriate to hold a view that is logically inconsistent. Doesn't matter who says it, the Buddha or God or anybody else. If it's logically inconsistent, then if it's irrational, then don't accept it. This is taboo, he says. But even more taboo is holding a view that is logically inconsistent. But even more taboo than holding a view that is logically inconsistent is holding a view that goes against direct experience. Now that's empiricism. And we have various modes of knowing that are articulated with great precision and detail in Buddhist epistemology. And it's said, unlike Aristotle, for example, that the highest mode of knowing is direct non-conceptual experience. Whereas for Aristotle, for example, the highest knowing is by reason. That unique faculty of man, of reason, women not so much, according to Aristotle. It was very, very gender biased. But reason has a role, but it's in the service of direct perception, rather than direct perception having a role to lead to some conceptual formulation that you can publish and get an award for, or at least get tenure. And so there's Buddhist empiricism. Then moving on. So we come back to introspection, because this really will be, as promised, this will be about the nature of mind, a radically empirical approach to mind, to consciousness. And so we come back to William James, who really is one of my heroes, and he is quoting or paraphrasing Robert Frost, he is the road less traveled, because he set this out as a strategy, an avenue that could be followed more than a century ago. And about 103 years ago, 1913 to be specific, with the rise of behavioral psychology, they simply threw this out lock, stock, and barrel. And they never revived it. They kind of put 3 bullets in its head and buried it. And so, but here's what William James thought. And that is introspective observation, he says, is what we have to rely on first, foremost, and always. In other words, for the scientific study of the mind, philosophers had been thinking about the mind for centuries. Nothing new about that. But what started in the late 19th century was the empirical and experimental scientific study of the mind. It took them 300 years from the time of Copernicus to even start it, which is kind of a long lag time. But when it got there, William James was really one of the strongest figures in that movement. And he said, this is how we should approach the study of the mind, as frankly as we approach the scientific study of everything else. Scientifically, whether you want to know geology or microbiology or astronomy, or you want to understand birds and so forth, your primary mode of investigation is to take very careful look, to observe with as much sophistication, precision, and rigor as you possibly can, to make replicable observations, and on that basis then you start to develop a science of whatever it may be. That's what Galileo did for both terrestrial physics as well as celestial physics or astronomy. So William James is taking that same approach for the mind. The word introspection need hardly be defined. It means, of course, the looking into our minds, our own minds, because those are the only minds we can actually look at, for most of us anyway, and reporting what we there discover. And everyone agrees that we there discover states of consciousness. So it's very commonsensical what he's saying here. Contrary to all of those, Neil deGrasse and so forth and so on, saying, you either can't do it, or if you do it, it's completely unreliable. But William James was not gullible or naive when it came to introspection. He didn't believe, as Descartes apparently did, that all of your introspective observations are clear and infallible. And William James, to the contrary, said introspection is difficult and fallible. That is, our visual observations can be profoundly misleading, all kinds of optical illusions. There are auditory illusions that are amazing, and we have other types of illusions as well. Under hypnosis, for example, you can bite into an onion and it tastes like an apple, and so on. Well, if our other 5 sensory modes of perception can be very misleading and illusory, which they certainly can be, then why should introspection be any different? It too can be fallible. But he says here, and I think quite rightly, the difficulty is simply that of all observation of whatever kind. In other words, it's not specifically introspection that's misleading. Just like, the critic of Galileo said, you're looking through a telescope, that may be an optical illusion. So, right, it's true. But now William James comes up with the solution. He says the only safeguard is in the final consensus of our farther knowledge, or later knowledge about the thing in question, later views correcting earlier ones until at last the harmony of a consistent system is reached. So I think he actually gave the solution. It's not a soundbite, but he said here's the strategy, and that is keep on looking, and if possible, of course, look with greater sophistication, greater precision, greater clarity, and then have intrasubjective validation. And then you can have a growing body of consensual knowledge. He's suggesting this. As I said, they tried this in a very amateurish, primitive way, frankly, from about 1875 until 1910. And then, with the force of the rise of behavioral psychology, they just scuttled it and never looked back. Right? Not in academic psychology. In Freud, Jung, clinical psychology definitely has a role. So we move on. So William James also, I think I affirm what he's saying here. He's writing again about 115 years ago. And he says, at present psychology is in the condition of physics before Galileo, and the laws of motion, of chemistry before Lavoisier, and the notion that mass is preserved in all reactions. The Galileo and the Lavoisier of psychology will be famous men indeed when they come, as come they someday surely will, or past successes are no index to the future. When they do come, however, the necessities of the case will make them metaphysical. That is, they will seem to be operating outside of the bounds of mainstream science. Metaphysical. Why? Because they're looking at something that's not physical. Obviously not physical. When you observe the mind, it has no physical characteristics. When you try to observe the mind using the instruments of technology, objectively and physically, it is invisible. So they're going to be deemed metaphysical. That's kind of like a curse. In science, psychology, physics, and so forth, if you're saying, you're being metaphysical, that's kind of like you're stupid. It's a total put down. I mean, I've heard it many times. Richard Feynman and psychology and physics and so forth, as soon as you seem to be metaphysical, which means maybe stepping outside the bounds of materialism, that means you've stepped into the land of la-la land, flakiness, airy-fairy, by the sheer fact that you're addressing something that may not be physical, which then isn't evidence at all, right? And so meanwhile, the best way in which we can facilitate their advent, the coming of these great individuals, and he says men, what he didn't see is famous men or women, because he was still stuck in the late 19th century where the men were doing all the heavy lifting, right? And women could not get a higher education. And he wasn't so far ahead of his time that he questioned that. Happily, that's one of the great advances of the 20th century. We're no longer that gender stupid. And so he should have said human beings, of course. But meanwhile, the best way in which we can facilitate those men and women's advent is to understand how great is the darkness in which we grope. And never to forget that the natural science assumptions with which we started are provisional and revisable things. To my mind, I think that's just magnificent. In the open, it's not dogmatic. It's not dogmatically anti-materialistic. It's just being anti-dogmatic altogether. And so that's kind of like, I don't know, a big statement. I'm looking for a better word than that. Like a strategy. So we move on. So we come back to Buddhism now. And we'll spend a lot of time in Buddhism. Now, this is what I wanted to do, is give a bit more challenging material than the other set of slides, which I'm very familiar with. And I think many of you are as well. So here's a bit familiar. And so the Buddhist empirical science of the mind, because that's really what it was. The Buddha was not starting a religion, have a whole bunch of beliefs about mind, but rather he devised very specific, radically empirical, logical ways to investigate the mind, and the only way that it can be investigated directly, and that's from a first-person perspective. But for that, just like Galileo needed a stable platform for his telescopes, when he went from 3 power to 30, which is pretty good advanced technology for one man, right, in his lifetime. Well, if you have a hold of 3 power, that's like an opera glass. You can hold that in your hands, no problem. But at 30 power, unless that's got a very stable mount, you won't be able to make any reliable observations. It's bouncing all over the place. So Galileo knew, of course, because it's common sense, that if you want to make reliable, precise, replicable observations through your 30 power telescope, you've got to have it firmly mounted, stable. You must be able to track, to observe with continuity, the phenomena you're seeking to observe and understand, like the phases of the moon of Venus, the phases of Venus, which he discovered. Or more interestingly, perhaps, his discovery that the little dots that appeared right around Jupiter actually move with it across the night sky, and they move around it. Well, he got that in 1 week, but that means he had to look repeatedly, carefully, rigorously, with a question. The little dots around Jupiter, are they left behind as Jupiter moves, or do they move with Jupiter, and do they move around Jupiter? And in 1 week, he discovered those were moons, which contradicted Western beliefs since Aristotle. They said all celestial bodies go in circles, perfect circles, around the Earth. But so simple, 1 week with a 30 power telescope. Any of us could do that. It's not that hard. But you have to have the stability, the continuity, and you must have very well polished lenses that are sharply in focus, well polished, and then you can make veridical observations. And that's what's been done ever since in fantastic progress in developing telescopes and so many other forms of instruments of measurement. But then when it comes to the mind, all of those instruments of technology are in a way useless in terms of making direct observations of the mind, because none of them show up. Brain activity, of course, behavior, of course, but dreams, thoughts, images, they're invisible. And that's because you're using a physical instrument to try to measure something that's not physical. What do? But then we can just stop there and say, well, we'll just go back to the physical and we'll do the best, drawing inference based upon behavior and brain activity. That's what the mind sciences have been doing for the last 100 years. Or you cannot give up on first-person observation, but recognize that if you're going to make rigorous, replicable observations from a first-person perspective, you must know how to train your attention. So you can stay focused, not for 3 seconds or 3 minutes, but for hours at a time, and do it day after day. It makes a very, very deep, rigorous, sustained, clear, high-definition observations of the mind. Then you might really get somewhere. But the first thing is develop attention skills, and secondly, apply those attention skills to your metacognitive awareness of what's going on in the mind itself. So that's what the Indians did, more so than any other society or civilization on the planet. I think this is one of their actually unique contributions. The Indians, thousands of years ago. It could have been 4,000 years ago, it could have been 5, it was definitely way before the Buddha came along 2,500 years ago. These counter-cultural truth seekers, they were called shramanas, they learned to develop stable, highly focused attention. They called it samadhi. More so than the Chinese, the Greeks, the Jews, the Mayans, or anybody else, this was one of their great contributions to civilization. And actually the West has still not discovered that they've discovered that. I mean, highly advanced yogis will be invited to laboratories, and then the scientists do what they're good at. They study their brainwaves and their behavior. William James thought the training attention was impossible. But that's because he never traveled outside of Europe. Never went to any one of those Asian countries where they've been training attention skills to a very high degree for centuries and centuries. That's how ethnocentric we were. We Europeans couldn't consider that those people might know something we don't know. And so Gautama refined sustained voluntary attention, or samadhi. He refined it. That is, he built on the tremendous progress that had already been made before him. And it was enormous. It was centuries and centuries of progress, developing extraordinarily high states of samadhi about which modern science knows nothing whatsoever, don't even know they're there. Even though the translations are all there and so forth, they still don't look. They can't imagine these people might actually know something they don't. But he took the pre-existing technology of samadhi, he refined it, and then with enhanced stability and vividness, so like the telescope that's firmly mounted with very polished in-focus lenses, he used samadhi in unprecedented ways to explore states of consciousness and their objects. So the first one's samadhi, the second one's vipassana, actual vipassana, not the incredibly watered-down version we have nowadays, which is really often not much more than simply being mindful. And so that was his innovation. It was one of his great innovations. As far as we know, nobody had ever done that before. Samadhi was seen as an end in itself. Achieve high degrees of samadhi, you find bliss, you find serenity, you find escape from all of the ordinary world. And Gautama first mastered that when he left home. But then when he came out of samadhi, he saw that there had been no radical transformation in his mind. And then he had to set out on his own. And out of his 6 years of austerities and then his tremendously innovative work, like Galileo taking a pre-existing technology of the telescope and using it in unprecedented ways. Because Galileo was the first person to use a telescope as a scientific instrument, whereas the Dutch, I expect, because I know a lot of Dutch people, I think they were using it to gaze at women. That's my hypothesis. You know, the peeping, I think. I'm not really sure. But they didn't use it scientifically. He did. Even though he's Italian. The Italian liked their women as much as anybody else, but Galileo liked something more, and that is he directed upwards, not across. And that's what Gautama did. I think it's not a silly parallel. He took the pre-existing technology of samadhi and applied it in unprecedented ways to actually explore states of consciousness, to explore the nature of suffering, the sources of suffering, the possibility of freedom, and the path to that. That was the union of shamatha and vipassana, or samadhi and insight. And then the Buddha sums this up. The mind that is established in equipoise, the mind that is balanced. Balance in cultivating a sense of ease, of stillness and clarity, discerning, intelligent, mindful. This is the mind that comes to know reality as it is. Knows reality, just for starters, of your own mind. Because like anything else, if you'd like to understand something, observe it carefully. It's kind of common sense, but Galileo brought it to a very high level of sense. And that's a union of shamatha and vipassana. We move on. Now, this is, on the night of his enlightenment, the Buddha had already achieved a very high level of samadhi. It's called the Fourth Jana, so it's very, very high. It's said to be the perfection of mindfulness. So he was in a very deep state of samadhi. And from that platform, like having this incredibly fine telescope, extremely focused, extremely clear, utterly calm and balanced, he directed his mind now, like a laser beam, and directed it to his past. And he said, when my mind was, my concentrated mind was thus purified, bright, unblemished, and rid of imperfection. Sounds like he's describing a telescope. Bright, unblemished, rid of imperfections, like lenses, purified, absolutely clear, and he's directing it back to his own past, beyond this life and past, when he had done so, and when it became malleable. That is, he's not going into a trance state, but malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, then I inclined my mind to the knowledge of recollection of past lives. And he saw them. He saw them. He saw countless of his own past lives. And that's what he says, I saw with direct knowledge. So he's claiming a discovery. He's not saying he's a prophet, or God granted him this, or other Buddhas had granted. He said, I just went through the training, and I developed this telescope of the mind, and then and this is what I saw. That's what he said. The Buddha then narrates how, with the achievement of the Fourth Jana, so a very high state of samadhi, he recollected the specific circumstances of many thousands of his own former lives over the course of many ages of world contraction and expansion. The expansion and contraction takes place over billions of years. So it's something analogous to Big Bang expanding, but if we put this in the 21st century, there being sufficient dark matter that eventually the acceleration of the expansion of the universe slows down, and then it goes and starts to contract and goes back into the big crunch. So it starts with Big Bang, big crunch, but that's just one cycle. Big Bang, big crunch, bang, big crunch. But then the Buddha said there are multiple universes that are operating out of sync happily for sentient beings. Because when it goes crunch, then anybody who has a body gets severely crunched. But you have another universe that's cropping up that is in expansion mode. So if you are migrating from lifetime to lifetime and your universe is crunching, go to another one that's, in better shape. And there are countless of those. So nowadays, contemporary state-of-the-art physics, they're debating right now, apparently the evidence is right on the cusp. Will the universe eventually contract or not? Einstein thought so, many astronomers think not. But there are many others, top-notch, world-class, that think, we may be dealing with multiverses here. And this is just our universe, but there may be others, and so forth. And moreover, modern astronomers speak of this taking place on the order of billions of years, so did the Buddha. So I'm not saying it's the same, but I think maybe the coincidence is not casual or merely by accident. And then the Buddha concluded, this was the first true knowledge attained by me in the first watch of the night. That was just the prelude. That's before he made his much deeper insights. Because this is simply discovering things that had been discovered earlier. That is, earlier highly accomplished yogis, Hindu yogis, had already accomplished, had gained direct insight into past life. But it seems, at least from the Buddha's perspective, that he could see far more. His samadhi was deeper, he probed much more deeply than others who could only recall a few thousand lifetimes, whereas he could recall many more. Pythagoras, one of our earliest philosophers in the Western tradition, it was widely believed during his time that he, who clearly advocated reincarnation, it said that he could recall 20 of his past lives, Pythagoras. And he also has some paranormal abilities, siddhis. And that's what he is mostly known for, not as a mathematician. But Aristotle writes about him, primarily as a wonder worker and a person with tremendous samadhi. And he may have learned it in Egypt. He traveled there. And there were Indian swamis in Egypt at that time. Not Buddhist, because he was a contemporary of the Buddha. He is an interesting guy. He may have learned samadhi from Asia. I doubt that he dreamed it up entirely on his own, because the Indians had been at that for a couple of thousand years by the time Pythagoras came along. But Pythagoras advocated reincarnation based on experience. Socrates did, Plato did, and it even occurs in early Christianity. Origen, who's one of the church fathers, advocated very clearly reincarnation within totally the Christian context. So this was the first true knowledge that attained by me in the first watch of the night. Ignorance was banished, and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished, and light arose, as happens in one who is diligent, ardent, and something. And something. So, something good, I think. Can you go back? Let's just see if we can get. Probably not. Okay, it slipped off. Doesn't matter. So that's just flat out. What do you discover just with samadhi alone? Because you don't need vipassana for that. That's just getting a laser, like a laser pointer, and be able to illuminate past life memories that are actually stored in a subtle continuum of consciousness that carries on from lifetime to lifetime. But that wasn't enough. Simply to know you have past lives doesn't liberate you. But it does show you the context of your inquiry. That if you have past lives, the chances are you're going to have more to come, in which case factor that in as you consider where you are in the universe. Now there's that, by modern minds, that is absolutely revolutionary. Absolutely revolutionary. To think of this life as being only one episode in a countless series of preceding episodes, and there are more to come. That there's no exit from reality is a very startling and daunting prospect. But now I wanted to kind of move this up a bit. So people who are very fresh to Buddhism as a whole, this will be a very steep learning curve. Because within Buddhism, there's no such thing as simply Buddhist philosophy as such, because there are multiple interpretations that have developed, been refined over many centuries. And here's kind of like, this is like Galilean. This is like, as Galileo is to physics, asking very basic questions and coming up with very brilliant insights, but they're still very basic. And then Newton went beyond, and beyond him went James Clerk Maxwell, beyond him went Newton, we went Einstein, and so on. Well, this is basic, fundamental, but I think actually very interesting and insightful. It's Vaibhashika. It's one of 4 schools of philosophical interpretation, very well developed in India over centuries. And this is the most primitive, the most basic, but I don't think it's crude. That's for you to decide. But when it says, I've called it dualistic reductionism, because here it is in gist. What's the basic premise? What kind of a world are we living in? And they say, well, as we're just kind of looking around, taking our first-person experience seriously, we look outwards and we see there's a lot of physical stuff out there. And we'll call this a chair, for example. We'll call that a slide projector. We'll call that a sock. Or better, maybe a shoe, a calcia. A calcia, a shoe, if he's wearing shoes. because he's the shoe guy, in case you wanted to know the shoe guy. But we look at all these things, we identify them, but then these pretty smart people there say, you look at a shoe, but of course that's viewing it from your perspective and your conceptual grid. A cockroach that bumped into it probably not think, oh, big shoe. Not likely, in other words, they don't have the word, they're not seeing it the same way. Another person might look at it and say, paperweight. People just love to walk barefoot. I have no use for that to put on my foot. Why would anybody want to put that on the foot? But that's a good paperweight. So what he's saying here is in these configurations of matter, viewed from multiple perspectives, it's all relative to your mode of perception and your mode of conceptualization, right? So there's this whole array of physical things we're seeing out there, and they're, as we conceive of them as if the chunk of this and a chunk of that, it's all relative. It's not absolute. It's not really objective. But that's not all that's going on. They were not, how do you say, prejudiced on taking only the physical to be real. That was actually more primitive than any school of Buddhism. They also, of course, practiced introspection. They're following the Buddha. You can't skip the mind and be a Buddhist. And then they found, this is an emotion. I'm feeling the emotion of feeling malaise. Well, they don't even have a word for malaise in Tibetan. Moreover, they don't have a word for emotion either in Tibetan. And so we have many, many words that have the nuance of English, Italian, French, and so forth. And so when we look at moods, when we look at these configurations of the mind, these too are seen from a human perspective. And, how do we say, we conceive of them within our familiar conceptual frameworks, but it's Sanskrit, it's Buddhist, it's Hindu, and so forth and so on. So they say, this is all relative. It's not what's really there. But they said, well, what's really there that is not dependent upon your perspective, your conceptual grid? What's really there? They said, well, what's really there, sounds a little bit like Descartes, is, well, there really are atoms out there. Just the basic units, that's it. Call it whatever you like. We generally call them atoms, or nowadays elementary particles. What there is really out there, independent of anybody's perspective, absolutely real, objectively, is little units of matter. That's what's out there. But of course, to say that's all that's out there is ridiculous, because we also are aware of, we have thoughts, emotions, perceptions of them. And so what is real subjectively are the individual units of mentation or consciousness. That's real. It's not a matter of perspective or conceptualization. So it's reductionism. It's saying what is ultimately real are the fundamental building blocks, but not just of the physical, as if somehow the mental emerges from the physical, which they thought was preposterous. But rather there are two types of fundamental entities, and the basic building blocks are absolutely real, and all the configurations of them, which we label from different perspectives, that's relative. So, dualistic reductionism. I don't think it's stupid at all. So there's a basis for this that I put together. This is from the Pali Canon, but it shows exactly the spirit of radical empiricism. And so here's the Buddha speaking, giving a very, very short discourse to a wandering ascetic by the name of Bahia. In the scene, there is only the scene. So there's all kinds of projections, labels, associations, conceptual category, associations, transference. I mean, psychologists know this very well. When you're listening to a client and so forth, how much they'll be adding onto experience, interpreting it. But he's saying here, when you see as much as you can, hold back on all the junk, all the stuff you're projecting, and to try to see as naked as you can. When you observe, try to just observe, and in the scene, let it be just the scene, and distinguish it from all that you're superimposing upon it. And likewise, there is only the herd. In the herd, there's only the herd. In the felt, that's tactile sensations, there's only the felt. And then he adds, in the cognized, this is mentally perceived, there's only the cognized. So we observe feelings and thoughts and perceptions and memories and dreams and images and so forth coming up. And he says, when you're perceiving things mentally, so no prejudice against introspection, just note nakedly, without the elaboration, without superimposition, what is simply arising from moment to moment. Just keep there. That is how you should train yourself. That's exactly radical empiricism. So that's what he's saying is true, but then for you, when you develop this ability, you learn how to really observe silently without all of the obsessive, compulsive superimpositions upon reality. When for you there is only the seen in reference to the seen, only the heard in reference to the heard, only the sensed in reference to the sensed, that's the tactile, and the cognized in reference to the cognized, then Bahia. There is no you here. That is, you see you as a separate agent, a subject, no evidence. Something you were superimposing all along, I'm looking at that. This separate ego, entity, I, not to be found. There is no you here. When there is no you here, there is no you there. That is, these are just thoughts, but not my thoughts. These are just images, but not my image. Sounds, but not my sounds. Thoughts, memories, and so forth, but not my thoughts. I'm not in them, they don't belong to me. So I'm not in here, I'm not out there. When there is no you here, there, so when there is no you here, there is no you there. When there is no you there, you are neither here nor there, nor between the two. Just this, is the end of suffering. So he's showing liberation by just seeing reality as it is without conflating it with our many superimpositions upon it. So that's basic, that's entry level. Let's move on, see where we go from there. So that's considered widely, universally in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. That's the most basic. You learn that one early on. But then you can move beyond that to a greater level of sophistication, Sautrantika. And I call this pluralistic realism. Let's just look at it. And that is, I think it is more sophisticated. Let's see. What we directly perceive with our physical senses consists of subjective representations of objective phenomena that are really out there, independent of our percepts and concepts. So it was the criticism of Galileo, that is, you're looking through the telescope, but you're not seeing images that are out there. You're seeing representations which are relative to your subjectivity, but they do correspond to something out there. In other words, you're not just hallucinating. There is a moon out there when you're not looking, but when you do look, you're seeing a subjective representation of it. And you're seeing the moon by way of a representation. So that would be this view, that would be their retort to the fellow who wouldn't look at the telescope because it's all illusions. Say, well, they're illusory, but that doesn't mean there's just a hallucination, like you're psychotic. You are observing the moon, which anybody would say nowadays, any astronomer would say, if you look through a telescope, are you looking at the moon? And they would say, yeah. They say, but aren't you looking at an image generated by your brain? And they say, yeah. By way of an image generated by your brain, you are in fact looking at the moon. We wouldn't have gotten there. We wouldn't have people walking on the moon if all our observations had been completely hallucination. Ridiculous. So we are seeing, but by way of, we're seeing things that are independent of our perceptions, by way of our perceptions. That sounds very familiar. That's Newton. That's Newton. And that is, we are observing objective reality, what is out there from God's own perspective, but we're seeing objective reality by way of our sensory perceptions. And we're making sense of it by way of our human thoughts, language, and so forth. So the physical world is objectively real, say the Sautrantikans. It's really out there, just like it's called Metaphysical Realism. The universe is really out there, and we are trying to represent it by way of our perceptions, developing theories. It is objectively real, but it is perceived and conceived in various ways, of course, by different people, but also by different species and so on. It's perceived and conceived in various ways depending on the specific nature of our sensory faculties, that of a bat or a human being and so forth, our conceptual frameworks, theistic, non-theistic, materialistic, and so forth, and languages. So as I said, we're all of us English speakers, we know perfectly well what emotion means, and there's simply no word for emotion. It's not that they don't have a word for anger and joy and sadness and contempt and disgust. They have all of those words. They don't have the category. They don't have the category of emotion. They never needed it. They have a category called klesha, mental afflictions. We don't have that one. We had to make up a term, klesha, mental afflictions. We didn't have it. We have vices. We have neuroses. But we don't have a term. We don't have a term. If a person has a very strongly developed sense of I am, they say, well, you have a very strong sense of who you are. Good for you. Jolly good. And the Buddhists would say, well, you're delusional. So, different take on the same kind of experience. So, objective reality in and of itself is unknowable apart. That is, this sounds like Kant. Objective reality in and of itself is unknowable apart from our subjective perceptions and the theories we formulate on the basis of those appearances. But it is out there, and we can know it by way of subjective perceptions and theories. But real objects must exist out there in order to account for the consensual nature of our experience. There has to be real moons. We didn't invent it. There were already moons around Jupiter. We didn't invent those. Galileo didn't invent them. The Higgs boson was something that was not created with a $7 billion contraption. They built the Large Hadron Super Collider to see whether the Higgs boson was already there, not whether they could create one. If you want to create particles, buy some popcorn. Put it in the popcorn, you'll create some popcorn particles. But they made that very expensive gadget to try to discover something really core about the nature of matter. The kind of the particle that gives all other particles mass. That's why they got so excited. Not thinking, oh, we created one. No, that would be a very expensive particle. You can't even sell them when you're finished. But real objects must exist out there in accordance to account for our consensual nature of experience. That is, Tibetans and Christians and Buddhists and Chinese and all kinds of people look at the moon, and we describe the moon in very similar ways. And then people from all different worldviews came into this room, we described it in similar ways. So the fact that we do have a sense that although viewed, articulated, conceived in different ways, nevertheless, it's kind of common sense. It's called metaphysical realism. There's something really out there. And there's really something in here too. There's something called mind. And it has many processes, and it doesn't depend simply on what you believe. That there is really a phenomenon called mind, there's really something called the physical world. To read that, the real objects must exist out there in order to account for the consensual nature of our experience, the fact that we experience so much of the world around us in common ways. But now this is more sophisticated than the straight kind of Cartesian dualism, mind and matter, right? Or the dualism of the Vaibhashika, elementary units of matter, elementary moments of cognition. Because this is again centuries ago, but they pointed out, number one, that which is real is something that presents itself to you. Concepts we project upon reality. But if something is real, it presents itself to your instruments of technology, to your physical senses, to your introspective awareness. And so, is there anything out there that's not composed of chunks of matter? Is there anything exists that it presents itself to us, that we perceive, we're directly aware of it, other than configurations of units of matter, and other than configurations of moments of awareness, visual, mental, and so forth? And they say, yeah. For example, time. We're not just imagining the passage of time. We experience it. But time is not made of matter. It's not just made of mind. So there's this pluralistic realism. It's a type of metaphysical realism, but there's more than mind and matter. There's time, for example. And then we can think, well, anything else. How about the laws of mathematics? But why do we ask this in the 21st century? The laws of mathematics, the laws of physics, they're not made of atoms, and they're not states of consciousness. And what scientist denies the existence of mathematical laws of nature? But they're not physical. They have no physical location, no mass. They have no physical attributes at all. But they're real, and you can observe them. You can observe the inverse square law of gravity. You can observe it. It's true, whether you believe it's true, whether you measure it or not, it's already true. So the laws of mathematics are not physical. Time is not physical. Information is not physical. Information, right? It has no mass, it has no location. You can't measure it physically. Semantic, meaningful information. Justice, beauty, the list goes on and on. People, individuals. You're not the same as a body, you have a body. You're not the same as a mind, you have a mind. You observe your mind. You're a person. But you as a person who has a body, observes your body. You're not you as a person, and not composed of atoms. Only materialists think that. They're in a tiny minority. And you're not simply a mental state. You're not simply a moment of cognition. You have moments of cognition. You have a mind. So the list goes on and on. There are many, many phenomena that are as real as anything else, but they're neither physical nor are they states of consciousness. So it's pluralism, and it's open book. Just by the way, William James was a pluralist. He was not a monist as a materialist. He was not a Cartesian dualist. He said, no, the world is richer than that, and we should keep it open. This is what I find so really truly dogmatic about materialism, is they just assume that the whole of reality fits into our category of physical. And anything that's real must be physical. So even when 96% of the forces in the universe are totally unexplained on a cosmic level, 96% are unexplained. They have no idea why the expansion of the universe is accelerating. It's unaccountable, inexplicable in terms of everything we know about the universe, except that it is doing. And the fact that the universe is still so coherent, we have these nice, neat galaxies and so forth and so on, there's no explanation within the known universe of why the universe is so orderly, and no explanation within the known universe of why the rate of acceleration is increasing. 96% of the forces pertaining to expansion, but also the contraction, are unknown. So what do we attribute that to? Dark matter and dark energy, but without knowing anything about them. So how do you know it's matter if you know nothing about it? Why do you call it matter? Why do you call it physical when you don't even know it's physical? It could be cerebrum and cherubim. I don't really have a way to develop that theory, but in principle, I know as little about seraphim and cherubim as I know about dark matter and dark energy. And that goes for the physicists too. It's a placeholder. It's basically saying whatever it is, it's physical. And so you theologians keep out. Well, we do this a lot. So, but William James is, let's just be pluralistic. Let's not assume everything fits into one or two boxes. In other words, as a materialist often present this, it's so crude. If you're not with us, against us, if you're not a physicalist, if you don't believe everything is physical, then you're a Cartesian dualist, and we know that's stupid. So they show the only alternative, it's like a straw horse, or a straw man. Straw man and a dead horse, I guess. So don't be the straw man and don't try to ride a dead horse. Something like that. In any case, they set up the opposition as being stupid and antiquated. Descartes, you're not with us? Then you must be a Cartesian dualist. I've had many neuroscientists say that. Oh, you Buddhist? Oh, you mean you're dualist? Because that's the only two categories they operate. The stupid one, Descartes, and them. And them is the entire universe fits into only one category. If you want to be really rich, then you can say, okay, there are 4 Gospels in the book of nature, according to materialism, 4 Gospels, and everything fits in the 4 Gospels. Mass, energy, space, time. Nothing outside of that. As if somehow the universe conformed itself, that we could capture all of it in 4 thoughts. I find that to be amazingly bold, to put it mildly, or ridiculous. But now we start challenging metaphysical realism, the notion that there's a physical universe out there, independently of anybody's perspective. This is Yogacara, or also called Chittamatra, mind only. It's philosophical idealism. So we have Bishop Berkeley, we have Hegel, who work along these lines in the West. But this is rooted in contemplative inquiry, unlike Kant and Hegel and others. Kant, but Bishop Berkeley was a clear philosophical idealist. A brilliant thinker, great philosopher, but not a contemplative. So they're just using their intellect to come up with the really interesting ideas. Where the Yogacara, this is entirely rooted in meditation. All of these are meditators. The Vaibhashika, the Sautrantikans, they're all practicing Samadhi Vipassana and trying to make sense of what they see. So this is suggested, that it is widely accepted in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. This is now more sophisticated than what we've seen thus far. So now, what's the premise here? All that we truly know is the reality of our own awareness and the sensory and mental appearances that arise to it. That is, when we really stop all the conceptual superimpositions and we peel it back, roll it back to right now, in terms of your 5 physical senses, your awareness of the surrounding universe and your body, peel it back to what do you immediately know. And here's the view. Well, what you actually know are visual impressions. They're not physical. They don't exist out there, not inside your cortex, not inside your eyeball, not in between. Visual impressions. Sounds, not out there, not inside your auditory cortices. Smell, taste, and touch, not physical, not located in physical space. And then we have all of our mental experiences, hopes, dreams, fears, memories, and so forth. They're not physical, they're not located in physical space. And so what do we really know if we're very, very strict, minimalist, That we can say, well, this we know and we cannot possibly doubt it. We cannot doubt this. So it's kind of going back to the type of certainty Descartes was looking for. Where can I start that nobody can doubt? And let me build a philosophy on that, trying to emulate Euclid, starting with axioms and building up a whole system of geometry. Well, Descartes wanted to do that, to develop a whole system of reality based upon an unassailable starting point. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Well, in the Yogacara, they say, well, what do we know indubitably beyond any possibility of doubt? Well, not the existence of an objective world. Bishop Berkeley was a very smart guy. He doubted that, intelligently, rationally. And there have been others as well. And so we can doubt that. We can doubt the very existence of the self itself. We can doubt that there is an I who thinks, and therefore I am because I think. How do you know you thought it? Maybe the thought just occurred. And maybe you're just a figment of your imagination. But what can you not doubt? So this is really radical empiricism. And it's cutting it closer to the bone. And that is, here's what we cannot doubt. We cannot doubt that we're aware. If you're doubting it, you're aware that you're doubting it, which means then you're not really doubting it. And so you can't doubt awareness, not reasonably. It is doubted nowadays. I see it, and it just boggles my mind that, some people are saying consciousness doesn't exist. Well, I don't know whether they came to that conclusion consciously or unconsciously. If unconsciously, then it doesn't count. If consciously, then it doesn't count. So there's one thing, awareness. You can't doubt that awareness is taking place, leaving out the first person I. But awareness is happening, and sensory and mental appearances. I mean, we can't doubt. If you have eyes in your sighted, you can't doubt their visual impressions. And unless your metacognitive ability is absolutely atrophied to nothing, you can't doubt that feelings like pain, happiness, surprise, fear, you can't doubt that. We can't doubt the reality of suffering, which is where the Buddha started in a spirit of radical empiricism. He didn't start with God or the beginning of the universe or I'm enlightened. He started with there's a reality of suffering. Can you really doubt that? So this now on a philosophical level, he said, okay, now this is what we can't doubt. This is what we know indubitably. Now whatever exists independently of these appearances, that it's what's really out there that's giving rise to the photons or the molecules or emitting photons and so forth, what exists independently of these appearances is unknowable in principle. And there are no grounds for attributing existence to something that can never be known. What they're saying here is whether you look with human eyeballs, human visual perception. And so we're seeing clearly anthropocentric visual impressions. Different for a bat, an ant, a rattlesnake, and so forth. But also let's bring this into the 21st century, because I think it's very sophisticated. And this is quantum mechanics. And that is, whenever you're making a measurement, you're not using God's eye. You're not using you're not using an anonymous absolute system of measurement. You're using a system of measurement that you created, and it's designed to measure something. So there are systems of measurement that are designed to measure photons, individual photons. And that shows that light consists of photons, little particles, little bundles of energy, photons. And you can see it. The evidence is incontrovertible that using this system of measurement, light is like a little bunch of BBs, individual discrete little bullets, right? Use another system of measurement, and it's perfectly clear light is a wave. It's a field, and it displays interference patterns. So it's a wave. I mean, waves are very well known in water, in other media. The interference patterns and so forth, waves are spread out over space. They're not composed of particles, so one thing cannot possibly be a particle and a wave. That's not possible. Like being a tomato and a giraffe. You can be one or the other, but there's just one thing, just by definition. You can't be a particle because the qualities of a particle are utterly different than the qualities of a wave or a field. But one system measurement says it's a particle, another system says it's a wave. What is it? Now, let's apply Yogacara to that conundrum, which is very well known in quantum mechanics, one of the most well-known things. But in fact, what is known in quantum mechanics, not just for light, but in fact, all particles of matter can be viewed as fields, as waves. And particles of energy can be viewed as particles or waves. So it goes for electrons as much as it does for photons. They can be viewed as fields, as waves, or as particles. and it depends on the system measurement. Then we can ask, that's the one field of science I've been really trained in. Then we'll say, okay, well, get impatient here. Okay, this system shows it's a particle, and this system shows it's a wave, but what's really out there independent of any system measurement? What's it like from God's perspective? What's already there before you make the measurement? And as Werner Heisenberg said, you're just posing a question for which there's no possible answer. Because the only way you could try to answer that would bring in another system of measurement. But what you'll be observing with that system, observing or measuring with that system of measurement, will arise relative to that system. And then bring another one, and it will arise relative to that system. You can never bring in a non-system and observe what is there independent of a system. Every observation you're ever making is rising relative to the system. Always, universally, making the same point. And Heisenberg was the one that says, let us not attribute existence to that which is unknowable in principle. And so is the universe, the physical universe as it exists out there independently of our perceptions and all of our measurements, as it exists out there independently, is that knowable? In principle, is it knowable? And the answer is no. Whenever you make a measurement, it's rising relative to that system of measurement. So therefore, the universe, the physical universe, which exists out there prior to and independent of all measurements, sensory or technological, is unknowable in principle, and therefore there's no reason in the world to posit its existence. Therefore, we're going to stick with what we know to be true and not imagine there's a truth out there that nobody's ever seen. In other words, matter now, matter or the objective physical world is taken the status of God for non-contemplatives. Something we believe in, we worship, we believe is the ultimate ground of being, but nobody sees. Nobody can know, because God infinitely transcends the limits of the human mind, a very common theological perspective. So I call scientific materialists, I call them materiologians, because they're talking about the ultimate nature of reality, which neither they nor anybody else has ever seen. Because whenever they make a measurement, it's always information arising relative to a system of measurement, but information is not physical. So everything the scientists actually deal with is not physical. Information and appearances and information, neither one is physical. They've made a conceptual construct of physical, conceptual constructs of particles and fields, space, time, energy, but these are conceptual constructs superimposed upon that which is not physical, and then considered to be ultimate and objectively real, but they're imagining that and never perceiving it. So the conclusion is all that really exists, all that we can know is awareness, and the appearance is to awareness, and so this is mind only. This mind only conclusion is not something derived on the basis of logical reasoning alone. Instead, it requires a combination of experiential, contemplative inquiry into the nature of the mind and its relation to the world of the physical senses, together with the use of reason to make sense of one's observations. So many of the greatest proponents of the Chittamatra were some of the greatest epistemologists in the history of Buddhism, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and others. They believed in mind only, but they're also the primary pillars, the greatest of the greats, when it comes to epistemology and logic. Dignaga, Dharmakirti, the greatest of all time in the Buddhist tradition. So it's not just empiricism, but it's making sense with reason of what we do experience and distinguishing between what we superimpose and what we actually experience. This is a rational conclusion based upon empirical investigations using contemplative science rather than the materialistic science as we know it today. The culmination of such contemplative inquiry is not merely the intellectual formulation of a physical position, but rather an immediate, non-conceptual experience of the non-duality of subject and object. So I is not in here, the I is not out there, and the I is not in between. That what they're suggesting is like systems thinking. And that is, we're not dealing with discrete chunks of reality that bump into each other, which is a very Newtonian view and a very Sautrantic view, that there's chunks of matter out there and then there's units of consciousness here, and they come together and bang and give rise to subjective impressions. But in fact, if you look for those chunks of matter independent of all systems of measurement, you can't point to anything, because all you can point to are impressions, information, observations made with a specific system of measurement. And so this means that that subject-object, in every case of subject-object, whether it's observing another person or the moons of Jupiter or observing your own thoughts and emotions, the act of observation is a system and not a combination of two independent units. Therefore, subject and object are always entangled. They're always fundamentally non-dual. Not the same, but not independent and coming together, but rather rising together. Rising together. We're not even finished yet. We have at least another one. The Madhyamaka, the middle way, the one that's trying now to avoid all extremes, and I call this ontological relativism or ontological relativity. So here's the Madhyamaka view. Now each one is critiquing the previous. So the Sautrantika critiqued the dualistic reductionism of Vaibhashika. Chittamatra comes back and critiques. You say all these are representations of an objective reality, but who's ever seen that objective reality? All you get are representations, which means they're not representations, they're presentations. And the presentations are primary, not that what you think you're representing, because you're not representing, because you're never representing what was out there prior to the act of measurement, right? So the Madhyamaka says, oh, okay, well, wait a minute here. Now they're going to critique Chittamatra. So as I said, this is a very steep curve tonight. If you've never heard of any of these four, then I should have given out seatbelts. So the Madhyamaka says, look, both matter and mind, these two categories, matter and mind, are simply conceptual constructs imputed upon appearances. The appearances of your own awareness, the appearances to your awareness, and neither one has any existence of its own independent of these conceptual imputations. So just as the physical world has no inherent existence, it's not out there independent of all systems of measurement, has no inherent existence independent of words and concepts, neither does the world of the mind have any independent existence independent of words and concepts. There's no physical reality, no real physical world existing independently out there, and there is no real mental world existing independently in here. So the materialist says that what's real is the physical world out there, and mind and thought and consciousness, these are all derivative of, either identical to brain activity or derivative of complex configurations of physical phenomena. One of the two, either identical to something physical and real, or an emergent property of that which is really real, and that's the physical. But that means all of our subjective experience is epiphenomenal, derivative, secondary, illusory, and not to be taken very seriously. Let's get back to work, roll up our sleeves, and get back to studying what's real, and that's the objective, the physical quantifiable, right? The Chittamatran said, well, you got that exactly wrong. That which you think is real doesn't exist at all, and the only thing that's real is awareness and appearances to awareness. But then the Madhyamaka says, look, you Chittamatrans have just said that you have no grounds, no one has any authentic grounds for positing or affirming the existence of a physical universe independent of all measurements, because it's unknowable in principle. And we will say the same thing is true of the mind, or of awareness itself, and that is whenever you observe awareness, it's not a view from nowhere, to use Thomas Nagel's term. It's not a view from nowhere, it's a view from your perspective. But now we're back to the same conundrum. You're observing your mind from your perspective, not from no one's perspective, not from God's perspective. And your perspective, as William James said, is fallible. And it's influenced by various factors. And so when you observe your own mind, this also is relative to the system of measurement, directed inwards. But who's ever found the mind as a thing in itself, independent of context, independent of anything outside of mind? So the mind as an autonomous, absolutely real entity is no more findable than the physical world is findable. All you always have is always relative. It's an ontological relativity that goes right down to the ground. This one's saying, we're going to invite the physical world back in. There is a physical world when nobody's looking at it. But as soon as you conceive of it, when you think of atoms and particles and black holes and everything else, it does exist. It does exist when you're not looking at it. Yes, the moons of Jupiter existed before you looked at them. But when you say moons of Jupiter, you've just couched that in language, in a conceptual framework. The moons of Jupiter, atoms, particles, Higgs boson, they do exist. They do exist when you're not looking at them. So yes, using the Large Hadron Super Collider, they did discover the Higgs boson. Does the Higgs boson exist independently of the Large Hadron Supercollider? Yes. Does the Higgs boson exist independently of the conceptual framework in which it was conceived? No. Because the word Higgs boson doesn't mean anything independently of the conceptual framework in which it was conceived. So just as visual impressions arise relative to visual perception, so do all of our theoretical constructs about the universe. From elementary particles to galactic clusters, they do exist, but they exist relative to the mind that conceives them. And the mind that conceives them doesn't exist in and of itself. The mind that conceives them exists relative to the things that it conceives. Visual perception doesn't exist independently. Visual perception exists only relative to visual appearances. Visual appearances arise relative to visual perception. They all are arising relatively, and none of them is an ontological absolute. Neither matter nor mind. So Chittamatra, you got it half right and half wrong. In fact, you got it all wrong. Because you threw the baby out with the bathwater when they came to the physical world, and you said there isn't any. That it's all just that all of physics is complete fiction, existing only in the imaginations of physicists. And that's not true. The moons of Jupiter were out there before Galileo. He didn't make them up. There is a physical world out there. There is a subjective world in here. But it's not really out there independently, and it's not really in here subjectively. They do exist, but interdependently, ontologically relative to each other. The physical world may indeed be said to exist independently of sensory appearances, independently of our physical measurements, using telescopes and so forth, and there are dimensions of consciousness that exist independently of any physical basis. Now that's something science knows nothing about, because they're only looking at things that do have a physical basis. They don't practice introspection. They've never developed samadhi. So if there is a dimension of consciousness that carries on beyond death, the behaviorists and the neuroscientists will be the last people to know. Because all the behaviorists know is dead bodies don't behave, and all the neuroscientists know is dead brains don't do anything, except decompose. So if there's anything continual, they'll be the last people in the neighborhood to know. And the first people to know will be actually people who are looking at consciousness and exploring subtler dimension of consciousness that may not be contingent upon the brain. So, but these external physical and internal mental events do not inherently exist independently of conceptual designations. So the word conceive now really does have a double nuance. Conception is these are thoughts, but also we are conceiving of the world. With our conceptual formulations, we're drawing things into existence by the power of conceptual designation, and they do exist. When I was first starting to ask these questions, I was being trained by Geshe Ugyen Seten. He's one of the great Madhyamaka masters living in, teacher of many of my teachers, Geshe Ngamtagi, one of his teachers. And I was in my late 20s starting to ask these questions in quantum mechanics. And he took me aside, and I was translating for him. And he said, Allan, be careful that you don't refute the existence of atoms. Don't get carried away here. Atoms do exist. Elementary particles do exist. We're not challenging whether they exist, we're challenging how they exist. Obviously, I didn't forget what he said. And so by recognizing that these external physical and internal mental phenomena do not inherently exist independent of conceptual designations, by recognizing the symmetry of the emptiness of inherent nature, the Ding an sich, the existence in of themselves, of physical and mental phenomena, objective and subjective, we avoid the philosophical extremes of both materialism and idealism. And we get there in a spirit of radical empiricism all the way through. We continue, we're not done yet. There's something that is beyond but subsumes, embraces but is not limited to, the profound middle way insights of the Madhyamaka, and that's Dzogchen, or the Great Perfection, where they highlight the one taste of purity and equality of all phenomena, samsara, and the whole bandwidth of samsara. So the culmination, I'm suggesting here, the culmination of the path of radical empiricism that brought us from materialism to coming back to our senses and recognizing the mind is as real as matter, and right through Sautrantika, Yogacara, and Madhyamaka, the culmination of the path of radical empiricism occurs when we realize the non-duality of samsara and nirvana, that they are not inherently separate. No longer bound within the miseries of the former, of samsara, while not lost in the utter transcendence of the latter. So neither absorbed within samsara, which we're very familiar with, nor completely leaving samsara behind and being totally absorbed in the transcendence of nirvana. So this is the kind of middle way of the Dzogchen, generally Mahayana, but then specifically the Dzogchen. For the first time we are truly awake to the nature of the whole of reality, manifesting as displays of the non-duality of primordial consciousness and the absolute space of phenomena. Or Buddha mind and Dharma Dhatu, Rigpa pristine awareness and Dharma Dhatu, Buddha nature and emptiness. That there is a primordial non-duality of the deepest dimension of consciousness that is truly transcendent, beyond space and time, and the deepest dimension of reality as a whole, which is Dharma Dhatu, the absolute space of phenomena, out of which emerge all configurations of relative space-time and so forth. And this is the great perfection. Being perfectly awake to this great perfection, all that remains to be done is to awaken everyone else in the dream. You awaken from the sense of the duality of samsara and nirvana. You awaken to the illusory nature of yourself as a sentient being. You identify your own Buddha, your own deepest nature, your primordial nature, and you awaken to the fact that you've never been other than a Buddha. So the Dalai Lama has counted on this. He's quite a consummate master of Dzogchen himself. And he comments here, for us older people, this comes as a great sense of relief. When you rest the mind, putting it out of work, I feel like doing that every day. The vital energies, the prana, naturally become refined, and solely by non-conceptual meditation, you slip into the clear light of the mind, into the clear light. That's primordial consciousness, pristine awareness, Buddha nature, Dharmakaya. You slip into the clear light with the mind and vital energies, and that is, your mind dissolves into its primordial ground. Your vital energies dissolve into the energy of primordial consciousness. This requires settling in complete inactivity, which is not easy. That was my best shot. And I'm sure he was laughing when he said that. He said this in San Jose when he first taught Dzogchen. Well, not the first time, but one of the earliest times, back in 1990. But he's suggesting this kind of statement is unique to Dzogchen Mahamudra. And that is that through that utter inactivity, that utter release of all activity to try to strive to become someone you are not, release that, and you will realize who you've always been. So moving on, I think I have a little bit of, not much time, I'm going to move on. So I could stop there, that'd be fun. But I would like to bring this, because it sounds like we've gone way off into some esotericism of the mystical East, and I'd just like to come back to 20th century physics. Radical empiricism in physics. It's not all dumbbell materialism and so forth. Anton Seilinger is a very astute man, philosophically trained, brilliant experimental physicist, also a very nice person. I know him personally. He's a wonderful human being, and done some of the most cutting-edge research in the foundations of quantum mechanics. He makes this statement, and it's a statement based on, he's a radical empiricist. If you get to know him, he is a radical empiricist. And this is what he says based on his experiments, which are world-class. I'm going to read it. One may be tempted to assume that whenever we ask questions of the nature of the world there outside, there is reality existing independently of what can be said about it. We may be tempted to assume that. We, that is he, will now claim that such a position is void of any meaning. It is obvious that any property or feature of reality out there can only be based on information we receive, the system of measurement. There cannot be any statement whatsoever about the world or about reality that is not based on such information. It therefore follows that the concept of a reality, without at least the ability in principle to make statements about it, to obtain information about its features, is devoid of any possibility of confirmation or proof. So as soon as you start talking about the world as it exists independently of measurement, you're neither here nor there. You can't confirm or disprove. This implies that the distinction between information, that is knowledge, and reality is devoid of any meaning. You're not bringing two things together. But every time you have knowledge, it is intertwined with that which you're knowing. This is very familiar from what I just read. But this is now a man who's not studied Buddhism and just coming straight out of physics. Eventually, what we're talking about is, again, a unification of very different concepts. The reader might recall that unification is one of the main themes of the development of modern science. So that may strike you as familiar. Thomas Hertog, student of Stephen Hawking, a very fine theoretical physicist. I've heard a talk of his that was simply brilliant, and I've extracted this from one of his talks quite recently. State of the art, he's right there, knowing the cutting edge theoretical physics. Speaking of quantum reality, quantum cosmology, string theory, M theory, he says you can think of that quantum reality a bit like a tree. The branches represent all possible universes. We are part of the universe, so we are part of that tree. And our observations select certain branches and hereby give meaning or give reality to our past in a quantum world. Quantum theory indicates that we may not be mere chemical scum, which is the view of materialists. Life and the cosmos are, in the quantum theory, a synthesis. Life and the cosmos. A synthesis, and our observations now give, in fact, reality to its earliest days. That even the history of the universe is rising relative to our observations in the present and do not exist independently of those observations. Let's go on. Almost finished. Next one. There we are. Another one. This is a theoretical physicist, again world class, recipient of the Fundamental Physics Prize. I'm just highlighting these are not flaky people, new agey people. There's some of the creme de la creme of modern experimental and theoretical physicists. André Linde is very renowned. And he writes here, and I quote, "The universe becomes alive, that is, it evolves, it transforms, it's time-dependent only when one divides it into two parts, an observer and the rest of the universe. Then the wave function of the rest of the universe depends on the time measured by the observer. In other words, evolution, the whole transformation of the universe from the Big Bang, evolution is possible only with respect to the observer. Without an observer, the universe is dead." It's called the problem of frozen time. If you take the observer out, there's no time, there's no transformation, the universe doesn't evolve. This is not flaky physics, this is very mainstream. So he raises his question now, will it not turn out, and we're missing the bottom line unfortunately, will it not turn out with the further development of science that the study of the universe and the study of consciousness will be inseparably linked, and that ultimate progress in the one will be impossible without progress in the other? After the development of a unified geometrical description of the weak, strong electromagnetic and gravitational interactions, the next important step not be, and I can only paraphrase, the inclusion of consciousness in our fundamental understanding of the universe? That we've left it out and thought that was insignificant. That it was an accidental byproduct of chemical scum with maybe some electricity and warming. They've trivialized consciousness almost to the point of non-existence without knowing anything about it. And it's the physicists, not the neuroscientists or psychologists, who are coming to the rescue. So, yep, is that the last one? Yeah. Okay, that's enough. He ends this in a way I think is delicious. Not with, I know the nature of reality, now listen, I just told you. But might this be the case? And then ... So it's good. We just kind of... And then, well, check it out. Let's find out whether it's true or not. Yeah. So, that's that. So that was a radically empirical approach to the study of consciousness. That was also radical empiricism in Buddhism. So call it what you like. Any comments or questions? Yes, please, you betcha.
Tibetans say that the middle way school is the ultimate development in philosophical...
Quite so.
But Buddhist Western historians say that it preceded the mind-only school.
The mind-only school,
Yeah, how does that work?
Western historians make up a lot of stuff. They do. They just do. I've been in that field for 10 years, 6 years as a graduate student, 6 and 4 years as a lecturer in the finest religious studies department in the United States. There's a lot of conjecture there. But now, they may not be wrong, but they may not be right. First of all, if you check out the Pali Canon, you can easily find this. In the Pali Canon and in the Milinda Pinya by the conversation between Nagasena and King Milinda, or Mahinda in Greek, it's the analogy of a chariot. And you'll find it in the Pali Canon with a nun, Vajra is her name, raises the analogy of a chariot, and then Nagasena, the great Arhat, raises the analogy of a chariot. And so it's right there in the canon and in one of the most formidable commentaries in the whole Theravada tradition. And the gist of it is very simple. And that is, what is a chariot? And is a chariot its wheels, its yoke, its planks? What is a chariot? When you look at individual parts, and the conclusion is, well, none of those individual parts are a chariot, nor are, if you just throw all the parts together, that's not a chariot. A chariot is a word, and we impute it upon that configuration of the parts when we decide to. But the existence of a chariot is not something that is happening objectively, independently of our conceptual framework. That you can damage a chariot, and you can keep on damaging. At what point do you say there's no longer a chariot there? When you just stop calling it a chariot. And if you're making a chariot, at which point do you say this is a half-built chariot? This is a chariot that's almost completed. At what point is it a chariot that is almost completed or not quite completed? At what point is it a chariot? When you say so. And so I've spoken with one of the top scholars of Pali Canon, and I just couldn't get any movement there. I think he was really, didn't want to stop being a Theravada Buddhist. Because they said, this is Madhyamaka in the Pali Canon. That all phenomena, there's nothing special about chariots. That goes for acorns and elementary particles and galaxies and people and everything else. What these two brief references are saying is that as we can look at a human being and say, well, what am I, a body or a mind? I'm not a body, I'm not a mind, I'm not simply a combination of the two. But if I look for myself outside of the configuration of body-mind, I'm not to be found. Look outside of the configuration of all the parts of a chariot, and look if there's something separate from all the parts that is a chariot, not to be found. The chariot analogy is saying that the same mode of analysis that leads to the insight into the non-existence of an inherently existent self immediately implies the non-existence of a chariot. But if we're going to go to a chariot, that's a slippery slope, and I've just taken on the entire physical universe. All the five skandhas and everything else. So that looks like Madhyamaka to me, and that's Pali Canon. We don't get anything earlier than that. At the same time, all phenomena are preceded by the mind. Issue fourth of the mind consist of the mind. That's the first verse of the first chapter of Dhammapada. That sounds one heck of a lot like Chittamatra. All phenomena are preceded by the mind, issue forth from the mind, consist of the mind. And you'll find other similar statements. So basically, I don't believe that the Madhyamaka came first and the Chittamatra was something conceived by generations later. I think you find seeds of all of them. The dialogue to Bahia, in the seen, let there be just seen, but also in the mentally perceived, let there be just the mentally perceived, right? So the physical is the physical and the mental is the mental, and go down to the brass tacks, the individual units, and you don't find a self out there or in here or anywhere else. That's pretty much Vaibhashika, you know? At the same time, the Sautrantika is called Sautrantika, as in sutra, Ika, because it's so much based on the sutras. That the Buddha referred to many things that are not simply matter or mind, like people, and so forth. So it's pluralistic realism. And Theravada Buddhism is an expression of metaphysical realism, Theravada Buddhism. There is really a physical universe out there. And that creates real conundrums for contemporary Theravada Buddhists, if they're really thoughtful. Is because there are accounts of the universe and earlier Buddhists and so forth that are extremely hard to square with our understanding of the planet and so forth. And if you're a metaphysical realist, you're in a really tough spot. You either have to throw out science or throw out the words of the Buddha. And that's hard. Either one is hard. I would rather throw out metaphysical realism. Yeah. So that's my sense of it. And Dzogchen, I've read statements in the Pali Canon also that having studied, practiced, taught, and translated, and written about Dzogchen now for 26 years, I found things in the Pali Canon that are very suggestive of Dzogchen as well. Yeah. So I think they're coming all from the same source. That's my sense of it. Yeah. Anything else coming up? Yes, please, go ahead.
Just sort of thinking of the simplistic things. So when you're talking about that first interesting. So Heart Sutra and Diamond Sutra come back over and over again.
Absolutely. Absolutely, sure. Yeah. I mean, perhaps the most famous phrase in the Heart Sutra is Zukle, apart from form there is no emptiness, apart from emptiness there is no form, right? That non-duality. And then it goes, and then relative to emptiness. That's the best translation, I think. La. Relative to emptiness, there is no form, there's no, etc. There aren't the Four Noble Truths. There's no suffering, there's no achievement, there's no non-achievement. Relative to emptiness is simply showing the ontological relativity of all of them. That from the perspective of ultimate reality, all of these exist only relatively, but have no root. That's what they say, have no root, no basis in reality as existing in and of themselves. And so when I speak of Dzogchen, it's just completely apparent to me. I think nothing could persuade me that Dzogchen is not utterly compatible with Madhyamaka, and specifically the view of Madhyamaka that many, but not all Tibetan Buddhists embrace as the culmination, the highest, most subtle interpretation of Madhyamaka, and that's Prasangika Madhyamaka. Many do, but not all. Whereas I was trained in Gelugpa for the first 20 years, and it's just unequivocally, this is the subtlest, that no phenomenon has any existence whatsoever, independent of the conceptual designation of it. The phenomena arise relative to conceptual designation. Then I've studied the teachings on emptiness and independent origination within Dzogchen. It's exactly what it says. Specifically the writings of Dujom Lingpa. I've translated it.
In a marketplace today, they were selling T-shirts, and there was just a little blurb, and it said, "Don't believe atoms; they make up everything." And I just thought,
and we make up atoms. There's a nice quip. It's nice to have sound bites. They're really useful on occasion. So don't believe in atoms, they make up everything? Yeah, I like that. Or I like another T-shirt I've seen, because I spent 14 weeks in a one-on-one tutorial that I requested studying the four equations of James Clerk Maxwell. The four equations that explain all of all the realities of electromagnetism throughout the universe. Four equations did it, yeah? And so there's a T-shirt that lays these four equations out. They're quite short. Incredibly beautiful. That's what I wanted to see. So I studied four equations for 14 weeks. And so it lays out these four, and then said, God spoke, and there was light. But coming back to the earlier point, John Wheeler, and I didn't cite him here, but he was the voice behind these voices. John Wheeler was one of the great formulators of quantum cosmology, which we saw referred to by Anton Zeilinger, André Linde, and so on. Thomas Hertog also. And John Archibald Wheeler, who died not just a few years ago at the age of 98, he was one of the primary formulators of taking the principles of quantum mechanics and applying them to the entire universe, looking at the whole universe as a quantum system. And what he drew out of this, brilliant theoretical physics, of the stature of Richard Feynman. He's right up there with Richard Feynman. And his soundbite is, it's from bits. And the its are little chunks of matter, Higgs boson, particles, fields, waves, space-time, those are its. But he said, instead of thinking of its, and that is space-time, matter, energy, the four Gospels, as being fundamental and information emerging from matter, energy, instead of thinking that, he turns it on the head. Just like Galileo turned on the head. Instead of everything going around the Earth, okay, everything in the solar turns around the sun, right? Turning on the head is kind of a cool thing that brilliant people do. To just finish the thought, that it's widely assumed by his peers, and still to this day, that everything really boils down to space-time, matter, energy. Almost all biologists believe that, because they don't study physics very much. They don't study 20th century physics. Hardly any of them do. Neuroscientists don't. They don't have time. And so, skipping 20th century, 21st century physics, then the assumption is that the its are absolutely fundamental, and consciousness, information, everything else emerges out of complex configurations or organization of matter. But then John Wheeler, in this spirit of saying, what do we really know? And what we know is information. And information is not physical. And it's out of information that we human beings conceive of the categories of particles, fields, waves, space, time, and so forth. It's from bits of information. From information we construct the derivative categories of physical and mental and different types of physical. but what is primary is information. He said that's primary. And so, in other words, the entire universe, he says, I'm quoting him very closely here, the entire universe is best understood as an information processing system. But he emphasizes information is semantic information. That is, it's not simply the physicist's notion of information is corresponding to the degree of complexity or organization, which is physical, quantifiable. Semantic information always has a referent. It means something, where simply complexity doesn't refer to anything else. But the word house is not just a configuration of noise. It refers to something, house, outside of itself. So he's saying that information, semantic information, is fundamental to the universe, right? Information is primary. Semantic, meaningful, he emphasized it. It's not my interpretation. Meaningful information is fundamental to the entire universe. But of course, meaningful information does not exist unless there's something about which that it refers to. There's no information that doesn't refer to anything, then it's not semantic information. So now we have two elements. There has to be that which the information is referring to, let's call it the informata, and then the information that's referring to it. But this is meaningful information. Well, there's no such thing as meaningful information unless there's someone who's informed. Right? A book is not informed of anything. There's no information in the book. If that's the only thing existing in the universe is a book, it's just matter with ink. But there's no information there, unless there's some conscious being that put it in and can get it out. And so there is no such thing as information without someone who's informed. There's no such thing as somebody being informed without being conscious. You can't be unconsciously informed of anything. So now we have a triad. There has to be consciousness for there to be information. No consciousness, no information, but if there's no information, there's no one who's informed, because you're not informed of anything. But there's no information unless there's something you're informed about. But then you can't speak of something you're informed about without having the information about it. So we have three now. This is straight Madhyamaka. We have three. And information is primary, but information exists only relative to the informata and the informed. Take out one, the other two vanish. Any one of them, the other two vanish. Which means none of those three are independently existent. Because if they were, they would stand even when the other two are gone. Right? But this means that consciousness lies at the very foundation of reality. And the notion that it comes from complex configurations of electricity and chemicals is complete fantasy. With no basis, no empirical basis at all. It's just a widespread belief. It's a superstition. Yeah, interesting, yeah? Oh, yeah. Yes, please, go ahead.
You said you can't see this scientific revolution happening in your lifetime.
I couldn't hear.
Oh, yeah, you said you couldn't see this scientific revolution happening in your lifetime.
I said I hope it does, but I don't know whether it will or not. Yeah.
And when it does finally happen,
yeah.
What do you think the results will be? And do you think sort of technology moving the way it is, it could have an impact on it? Or?
It would be amazing if it didn't, because William James himself says that when this happens, I think it was he, pretty sure it's he, said that type of revolution will cast all the preceding revolutions in shadow. I mean, in terms of your own life, just take it very personally. Can you recall any decisions you've made through your 20-some years, I presume, maybe 30? Any decisions you've made over the course of your life that were different because the earth goes around the sun rather than vice versa? It is a revolution, but not for you. How about the notion that species are not static, that they actually evolve and mutate with genetic imputation and survival over millions and millions of years? Has that influenced any of the decisions you've made? But you believe it, right? Darwinian evolution, I mean, it's tremendous, very compelling. So they are revolutions. But 42% of Americans believe the universe is less than 10,000 years old. 18% 18% believe that the sun goes around the earth. Yeah. Check it out. It's the omniscient Google said so. How could Google do that? I asked Google, and Google spoke. I am the prophet. And it's there. The poll's been done. They've done again and again and again. And it's the fundamentalist Christianity. I mean, they're all the red states. All the ones that are voting for Trump. And I'm not kidding. They think he's a really smart guy, and they think the universe is less than 10,000 years old. There is a certain, connection there. And so they are brilliant revolutions. Galileo's revolution, Einstein, Niels Bohr, Max Planck, their revolution, brilliant. The Darwinian revolution, brilliant. But the impact of the revolution has not touched all of humanity, and it's more, and many people don't even really understand it, right? Whereas if this is true, that is multiple dimensions of consciousness, just the Buddha's first insight, that this is one of many lives, if this became a scientific discovery, with open-minded, critical, rigorous scientists, world-class, working with contemplatives who are tapping into that level of samadhi, in a controlled experiment, the most rigorously designed experiment, and when people start reporting memories from past lives, it's studied exhaustively by people who don't believe it, who don't want to believe it, but they are open-minded enough that if the evidence forces them to, then they will. If that should happen, then that will be published in Scientific American and the premier journals, and still a lot of people will turn away. If they turn away from, if they still believe in a 10,000-year-old universe, a lot of people will say, well, that's not what I believe. Because many people don't believe in science at all. But for those of us who are educated, intelligent, open-minded, who do believe that Galileo, Einstein, Darwin, and so forth have made brilliant discoveries, they will see that materialism is shattered. It has lost all credibility. Oh, completely. I mean, it's in rags. It's burnt. It's ashes. That it was enormous, widespread delusion that was embraced uncritically by the media and by almost all branches of science. And that will be very embarrassing for many people who've staked their entire reputations on it, refused ever to critically examine it, assuming they could get away with it forever, like believing uncritically in Aristotle and all the beliefs of medieval scholasticism and enforcing it with the tyranny of the church. That if you disbelieve, we're going to punish you. Disbelieve, question, as a neuroscientist today, question the assertion that the mind is simply a function of the brain, and you're looking at excommunication. You're looking at the loss of job, loss of funding, loss of credibility, loss of tenure. If you got tenure, then you'll be just insignificant. They know how to punish. And it's not only neuroscience, it's elsewhere. Question materialism, and you're going to find yourself in deep doo-doo very quickly. And I know this by listening to my one philosopher friend of mine. He's very prestigious, endowed chair and all of that. And he told me, Allan, I believe in a lot of what you say, but I cannot say that publicly. I cannot say it publicly. You and I can talk. That's why I'm not mentioning his name. I can't say this publicly. And so they fear. They're living in fear, right? Actually. If they're not living in fear if they don't question it themselves, but if they do, they know, don't question it publicly. My dear friend Francisco Varela, I think he took materialism as a working hypothesis, but not as dogma. He was a lovely man, a fantastic man to talk with. I really miss him still. But he was open to the possibility of looking into these things because he had so much prestige, had such renown, he had such security financially. He had a job that was lifelong money to do research for the rest of his life. So people like him could be bold because they had nothing to fear. But unless you're there, the only other people who are fearless are people retired. Then they're not trying to raise money anymore. Science is so money bound these days, and you cannot get anywhere unless you get funding for your research. You don't research, you're not publish anything, you're insignificant, you disappear, you're a non-entity. And if you want to conduct research, you have to go where the money is, and all the money, with virtually no exception, is to fund research within the paradigm of materialism. And if you step out, you've just stepped on very thin ice. Yeah. So Francisco told me that back in the 1990s, he died in 2001, yeah. But he told me back in the 1990s, when he was keenly interested in consciousness, but he's a cognitive neuroscientist, he's mainstream, and he said back then, So he's speaking of his field, just collaborating with other internationally renowned neuroscientists. He said, we could never even talk about consciousness in the lab. You couldn't talk, you do not mention the word consciousness. Don't talk about it. The only time we could talk about it was over tea. It's kind of like off the record. Nobody's around, no reporters, nobody's going to be peer review. Okay, over tea, what do you think about consciousness? It makes me really uncomfortable. How about you? Yeah, me too. So I'm hoping that it'll be your generation. My generation, scientists of my generation. Well, I think we're living according to the principle laid out by Max Planck, founder of quantum mechanics. And he says, science progresses funeral by funeral. And frankly, people of my generation are scientists. They've made almost without exception, they've made their reputations, their publications, their awards, their full professorships, rooted in materialism. And they cannot budge, any more than those two contemporaries of Galileo. Cannot budge. But the next generation, who hasn't yet climbed up the ladder, burn the ladder. Because our generation has to die off. Please don't help us, we'll do it in time. I'm not suggesting, wipe us out. We'll die naturally, but as we do, then we'll step aside, and another generation will come in, and I think will come in basically bored of materialism. Because what's more deadly than boredom? If you like it, then you want to keep it. If you hate it, you keep on juicing it up by hating it. Just like all the people are talking about Trump. Every time they talk about Trump, they bring him to the light again. That's what the media did. They keep on telling how much they hate him, and then he gets more and more famous. Whereas if you ignore Trump, then he'd just be one sleazy billionaire. And who would care? But we talk about him so much, that's why he's in the news. 4 out of 5 items is about Trump. People who love him and people who hate him. What I want to do is just let him go home and have a happy life. With his kids seem to really love him. And I think that's good. They seem like a really good father. I wish he'd just stay home and be a good dad. Not get into mischief. You didn't come here to hear my political views. And so have a good night. I wish you all well.